The clock on my dashboard glowed with a harsh, unblinking red light, reading 2:45 a.m., mocking my earlier promise to log off by midnight. I was cruising down the deserted interstate, the hypnotic rhythm of the tires humming against the asphalt lulling me into a dangerous state of highway hypnosis. My eyes burned from the constant glare of oncoming headlights that had long since vanished, leaving me alone in a tunnel of darkness. Just as I reached out to toggle the driver app offline, the familiar ping echoed through the cabin, flashing a premium surge fare that made me hesitate. It was a 40-minute drive out to the sprawling forested hills on the northern edge of the county, an area known for sprawling estates and old money. The payout was enough to cover my electric bill for the month, so I swallowed my exhaustion, tapped accept, and took the next exit toward the pickup point. The passenger was waiting outside an upscale downtown hotel, standing perfectly still under the ornate awning like a statue carved from shadow. He was a tall, gaunt man dressed in a sharp, dark suit that seemed out of place for the hour, clutching a leather briefcase with white-knuckled intensity. I pulled up to the curb, unlocking the doors with a soft click, and he slid into the back seat without a word, bringing a scent of sterile, cold air with him. I confirmed the destination aloud, a place called Blackwood Estates, but he only offered a curt, single nod in the rearview mirror as a response. The silence that settled in the car wasn't the comfortable quiet of a tired traveler. It felt heavy and oppressive, suffocating the ambient noise of the city. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, my eyes constantly darting to the mirror, unsettled by his rigid, unblinking posture. As we left the city limits, the comforting orange glow of the sodium streetlights abruptly ended, plunging us into the inky blackness of the rural highway. The road narrowed to 2 lanes, winding through dense, ancient timber that seemed to lean over the asphalt, their branches scraping the sky like skeletal fingers. The cell service bars on my phone display began to drop one by one, a visual countdown to complete isolation that always made my stomach knot. I tried turning on the radio to break the tension, but the signal was weak out here, offering only bursts of static that sounded like distant, frantic whispering. I quickly turned it off, the resulting silence feeling even louder and more hostile than before, emphasizing the rhythmic crunch of gravel under my tires. The man in the back remained a motionless silhouette, not once checking his phone or looking out the window, just staring straight ahead at my headrest. After 30 minutes of tense, silent driving, the GPS instructed me to take a sharp right turn onto an unmarked, unpaved driveway, hidden between massive oak trees. The path was narrow and steep, the loose stones causing my tires to slip and spin before finding purchase, throwing rocks against the undercarriage. A thick, unnatural fog began to roll in from the surrounding woods, clinging to the ground and reflecting my headlights back at me in a blinding white glare. I slowed to a crawl, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, silently cursing the surge pricing that had lured me out here. Through the swirling mist, a massive structure began to take shape, a towering wrought iron gate set between 2 imposing pillars of rough-hewn black stone. It looked less like the entrance to a wealthy subdivision, and more like the barricade of a medieval fortress designed to keep something terrible contained. I brought the car to a halt a few feet from the iron bars, expecting a guard shack or an intercom system to announce our arrival. Instead, there was only a rusted metal call box mounted on a concrete pedestal, its buttons worn smooth by years of use and exposure to the elements. "The code is 8142, the passenger finally spoke, his voice raspy and dry, as if he hadn't used his vocal cords in decades. I rolled down my window, shivering as the freezing fog poured into the heated cabin, and punched the numbers into the keypad with a trembling finger. A harsh, mechanical buzzer sounded, loud enough to make me flinch, followed by the deep, grinding groan of heavy metal scraping against stone. The massive gates slowly swung inward, opening just wide enough for my sedan to pass through before pausing, inviting me into the darkness beyond. I eased off the brake, the car creeping forward through the iron jaws of the entrance, the fog parting lazily around the hood of my vehicle. The moment my rear bumper cleared the threshold, the gate slammed shut behind us with a thunderous crash that shook the ground and vibrated up my spine. I jumped, startled by the violence of the sound, and looked in the rearview mirror to see the iron bars locked tight, sealing us inside the community. The landscape here was meticulously manicured, an artificial perfection that felt deeply unsettling, with identical rows of dark, silent houses lining the winding street. The lawns were uniformly cut, the hedges perfectly squared, but there was a distinct lack of life. No cars in the driveways, no toys on the grass, no porch lights on. It felt like driving through a pristine, life-sized architectural model, rather than a place where actual human beings lived and breathed. The GPS directed me deep into the labyrinth of identical streets, the blue line on the screen the only thing keeping me from getting hopelessly lost. We finally arrived at a house at the end of a dead-end cul-de-sac, indistinguishable from all the others save for the massive dead oak tree in its front yard. I put the car in park and unlocked the doors, overwhelmingly relieved to finally have this creepy passenger out of my vehicle so I could go home. He didn't offer a tip, nor did he say thank you. He simply opened the door, stepped out into the fog, and began walking up the dark driveway. I watched him go, expecting him to reach for keys or knock on the front door, but he just walked straight into the deep shadows of the porch and vanished. It was as if the darkness had physically swallowed him whole, leaving no trace that he had ever been in my car in the first place. I shivered, chalking it up to the fog playing tricks on my exhausted eyes, and swiped the bar on my phone screen to complete the ride. The app processed the payment, displaying the lucrative fare, which momentarily eased the knot of anxiety that had been tightening in my chest for the last hour. I threw the car in reverse, eager to put as much distance between myself and this ghost town as quickly as the speed limit would allow. I navigated the winding roads from memory, following the tire tracks I had left in the damp pavement, desperately seeking the massive iron gate we had entered through. The houses passed by in a blur of gray and black, their dark windows looking like empty eye sockets staring blankly at my passing headlights. The profound silence of the neighborhood pressed against the glass of my windows, a heavy, suffocating weight that made it hard to draw a full breath. It took me 10 minutes to find my way back to the main entrance, the fog having thickened considerably, turning the world into a murky, featureless soup. I saw the towering stone pillars emerge from the mist and let out a long sigh of relief, accelerating slightly toward the exit. I pulled up to the iron gates, expecting them to open automatically via a motion sensor buried in the asphalt, a standard feature in most modern gated communities. I waited for 10 seconds, the engine idling loudly in the quiet night, but the massive iron bars remained perfectly still, locked tight against the outside world. I pulled forward a few more inches, hoping to trigger the sensor until my front bumper was nearly touching the cold metal. But nothing happened. Panic, sharp and cold, began to prickle at the edges of my mind as I realized I was trapped inside the perimeter. I threw the car into park and grabbed my phone, intending to call the passenger and ask for the exit code, but the screen showed absolutely no service. The signal bars were completely empty, displaying a stark, no network connection message that shattered my remaining composure and sent my heart racing. I rolled down my window again and leaned out, peering through the fog for a keypad on this side of the gate. But the stone pillar was bare. There was no button, no intercom, no manual release lever. There was absolutely no mechanism designed to let a vehicle out of the community. I leaned on the horn, a long, desperate blast that echoed off the empty houses and disappeared into the fog, but no lights flicked on, no security guard appeared. The realization settled over me like a physical weight. The gate wasn't broken. It was designed this way, a one-way threshold into a neighborhood that never let anyone leave. I threw the car into park, leaving the engine running and the headlights blazing against the immovable iron bars, and stepped out into the freezing fog. The damp chill immediately pierced through my thin jacket, but the cold was nothing compared to the icy dread twisting in my stomach as I inspected the gate. I grabbed the cold iron and pulled with all my body weight, grunting from the exertion, but the massive doors didn't yield a fraction of an inch. I searched the nearby bushes, using the flashlight on my useless phone, hoping to find a hidden keypad or a buried emergency release lever left by the developers. There was nothing but wet dirt and perfectly trimmed hedges, confirming that this exit was sealed shut with a terrifying, deliberate finality that offered no mechanical escape. Retreating to the relative safety of the heated cabin, I locked the doors and stared at the steering wheel, my mind racing through a limited list of terrible options. With no cell service to call 911 and no way to force the gate, My only logical choice was to find the man who had brought me here. I put the car in reverse, the tires spinning slightly on the wet asphalt, and turned back into the labyrinth of perfectly identical pitch-black streets. Navigating the subdivision was harder this time. The fog had thickened into a dense gray wall, reflecting my high beams and reducing visibility to just a few yards. I drove at a crawl, counting the intersections and relying on my internal compass, desperately seeking the dead-end cul-de-sac with the massive dead oak tree in the yard. It took nearly 20 minutes of tense driving to locate the correct street, my anxiety mounting with every wrong turn that led to another row of empty facades. I finally spotted the twisted branches of the dead oak looming out of the mist, looking like a skeletal hand reaching up from the perfectly manicured lawn. I pulled into the driveway, the headlights sweeping across the front of the two-story house, expecting to see a light on in a window or a silhouette moving inside. The house remained completely dark, an imposing black silhouette against the gray sky, with a profound stillness that made my breath catch in my throat. I left the engine running, needing the psychological comfort of a quick getaway, and stepped out onto the damp concrete, the silence of the neighborhood pressing heavily against my ears. The walk up to the front porch felt like a march to an execution, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the dead quiet of the abandoned suburban street. I reached the heavy wooden door and knocked hard, the sound rapping sharply against the wood and echoing across the empty cul-de-sac like a gunshot. I waited, straining my ears for the sound of approaching footsteps, the creak of floorboards or the click of a lock, but the house remained absolutely silent. I knocked again, louder this time, shouting the passenger's name, demanding that he come out and give me the exit code so I could leave this miserable place. The only response was the echo of my own voice fading into the fog, followed by a creeping, paranoid sensation that I was being watched from the dark windows above. Frustration overriding my fear, I cupped my hands around my face and pressed my nose against the cold glass of the narrow sidelight window next to the front door. I squinted into the gloom, trying to pierce the darkness of the foyer, expecting to see a grand staircase, expensive furniture, or at least the outline of a hallway. Instead, the faint light from my car revealed a barren, unfinished room with exposed wooden studs, drywall dust coating the concrete floor, and dangling electrical wires. There was no furniture, no paint, no carpet, and absolutely no sign that anyone had ever lived in this house, let alone walked into it 10 minutes ago. The structure was just an empty shell, a Hollywood facade built to look like a mansion from the outside, hiding a hollow, lifeless interior that smelled of stale air and rot. A wave of dizziness washed over me as I stumbled back from the porch, my mind struggling to process the impossible reality of the hollow house. The passenger hadn't gone inside to sleep or to meet his family. He had walked into an empty, unfinished box and simply ceased to exist in the darkness. I practically sprinted back to my car, tearing the door open and throwing myself into the driver's seat, hitting the lock button repeatedly until my thumb ached. I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of the driveway, desperate to put distance between myself and the impossible house, not caring which direction I went. The fog seemed to swirl faster now, clinging to the windows and obscuring the identical houses, turning the subdivision into a dizzying gray centrifuge of repeating architecture and mounting panic. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, taking random lefts and rights, hoping to stumble upon a secondary exit, a maintenance gate, or a house with a glowing porch light. But the neighborhood was a fractal nightmare. Every street looked exactly the same, curving gently past the same dark houses, the same empty lawns, the same dead trees. I checked my odometer and realized with a sickening jolt that I had driven over 5 miles inside a subdivision that couldn't possibly be that large. It was as if the roads were folding back on themselves, creating an endless loop of asphalt and fog that trapped me in a continuous cycle of false hope and crushing disappointment. The fuel gauge was slowly dropping, a mechanical countdown to the moment my car would die, leaving me stranded on foot in this impossible empty purgatory. Just as I was about to pull over and succumb to a panic attack, my headlights swept across a shape that broke the monotonous pattern of the empty driveways. About a block ahead, parked haphazardly on the side of the road with its 2 passenger side wheels resting on the manicured grass, was a dark-colored sedan. My heart leaped into my throat. A car meant a person, A person meant answers, and answers meant a way out of this gated nightmare. I accelerated, honking my horn in short, frantic bursts to get the owner's attention, pulling up right behind the parked vehicle and bathing it in the harsh light of my high beams. I shifted into park and unbuckled my seatbelt, a relieved sob escaping my lips as I prepared to jump out and beg the driver for the exit code. As I stepped out of my car, the relief instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sinking dread that anchored my feet to the damp pavement. The car wasn't just parked, it was abandoned, covered in a thick layer of grime and dead leaves that suggested it had been sitting there for months, if not years. The tires were completely flat, the rubber rotting and sagging against the asphalt, and a thick layer of condensation coated the inside of the windows, rendering them opaque. On the rear window, mostly obscured by dirt, was a faded peeling sticker of a rival rideshare company, the neon pink logo cracked and weathered by the sun. I approached the vehicle slowly, the crunch of my shoes on the gravel sounding deafening in the silence, my hand trembling as I reached out to wipe away the grime on the driver's side window. I rubbed a small circle clean on the glass and pressed my face close, shining my phone's flashlight into the dusty, stale interior of the abandoned car. The driver's seat was empty, the leather cracked and faded, but the keys were still hanging in the ignition, dangling uselessly by a faded lanyard. On the passenger seat lay a dried-out, moldy leather wallet, spilling a few faded receipts and a driver's license that belonged to a young man with a bright smile. On the dashboard, a thick layer of dust covered a mounted GPS unit, the screen cracked and dead, frozen forever on its final failed attempt to find a route. I backed away from the window, the horrific truth settling over me like a shroud. I wasn't the first driver to be lured into Blackwood Estates, and the exit code wasn't a secret. It simply didn't exist. The realization that this dark sedan was a tomb for a fellow driver sent a violent tremor through my hands, making the flashlight beam dance erratically over the dust-coated interior. I leaned closer to the glass, wiping away more of the condensation and grime, and that is when I saw the frantic, overlapping scratch marks gouged deep into the interior side of the windows. They were the desperate, clawing remnants of someone trying to dig their way out of a sealed box. A visceral testament to a panic so profound it broke human fingernails against tempered safety glass. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the damp asphalt, gasping for air that suddenly felt too thin and cold to fill my burning lungs. The profound isolation of the neighborhood was no longer just creepy, it was a predatory trap. A sprawling concrete spiderweb designed to catch people who drove for a living and erase them entirely. I scrambled back into my own vehicle, slamming the door shut and hitting the lock button with a frantic, repetitive rhythm, until the mechanical clicks echoed like a metronome of my terror. The digital dashboard glowed with a harsh, indifferent light, highlighting the fuel gauge which had slipped dangerously close to the quarter tank mark during my aimless, panicked circling of the identical streets. I knew that once the engine died and the heater stopped fighting the creeping chill of the fog, I would be reduced to a shivering pedestrian in a neighborhood built for ghosts. I shifted the car into drive and slammed my foot on the accelerator, desperate to keep moving, terrified that if I stayed parked next to that abandoned tomb, I would inevitably become its neighbor. The fog outside seemed to thicken in response to my panic, swirling in aggressive gray eddies against the windshield, actively trying to obscure my vision and disorient my sense of direction. Rational navigation had failed me, so I decided to abandon the looping asphalt entirely and take my chances with the meticulously manicured lawns that separated the empty, hollow houses. If I drove straight across the properties, ignoring the curving streets, I reasoned that I must eventually hit the outer perimeter wall of the subdivision, a physical barrier I could potentially climb over. I cranked the steering wheel hard to the right, bouncing the sedan violently over the concrete curb and plunging into the pristine, dew-soaked grass of the nearest front yard. The tires spun and chewed through the turf, slinging dark mud into the fog as I plowed through a row of perfectly squared hedges, the branches shrieking against the metal side panels of my car. I kept the pedal down, navigating by the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the mist, determined to break the unnatural geometry of the neighborhood and find the edge of my prison. I crossed 3 identical backyards, smashing through pristine white picket fences that shattered like matchsticks under the weight of the vehicle. the wooden shrapnel bouncing off my windshield. The terrain was deceptively uneven, hiding sunken decorative ponds and concrete lawn ornaments that punished my suspension and rattled my teeth with every brutal, bone-jarring impact. Just as I thought the car's radiator was going to burst from the abuse, the headlights illuminated a massive solid black shape rising out of the fog directly in my path. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding wildly on the wet grass before sliding to a halt, mere inches from a towering wall constructed of the same rough-hewn black stone as the entrance pillars. I had found the boundary of Blackwood Estates, the physical edge of the map, but the sheer scale of the barrier immediately crushed any fragile hope I had of climbing my way to freedom. I left the engine idling and stepped out into the damp, freezing air, walking slowly up to the wall and placing my trembling hands flat against the freezing, porous surface of the black stone. It stretched vertically into the fog, disappearing into the gray soup at least 30 feet above my head, a monolithic structure that belonged to a maximum security penitentiary rather than a suburban housing development. The stone was slick with condensation and completely devoid of any mortar gaps, vines, or ledges that could serve as a foothold or handhold for a desperate climber. I walked along the base of the wall for 100 yards, trailing my fingers against the cold rock, searching for a crack, a maintenance gate, or a drainage pipe. But the barrier was seamless and absolute. I was a rat in a concrete maze, physically walled off from the rest of the world, and the realization brought me to my knees in the wet grass, staring up at the insurmountable darkness. As I knelt there in the mud, defeated and shivering, the oppressive silence of the estate was broken by a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins and my breath hitch in my throat. It was the rhythmic, deliberate sound of footsteps echoing off the asphalt of a nearby street. A slow, unhurried pacing that carried clearly through the dense, sound-dampening fog. It wasn't the frantic running of another trapped driver, nor was it the aimless shuffling of an animal. It was the measured, confident stride of someone, or something, patrolling its territory. The footsteps paused, then resumed, growing slightly louder, moving methodically through the labyrinth of identical houses, searching the empty driveways and manicured lawns for the source of the engine noise. I realized with a sickening jolt that my idling car, with its bright headlights illuminating the wall like a beacon, was drawing the attention of whatever ruled this empty purgatory. I scrambled back into the driver's seat, my boots slipping on the muddy floor mats, and immediately reached for the headlight dial, twisting it to plunge the vehicle into absolute darkness. I turned the key backward, killing the engine and cutting off the heater, plunging the cabin into a suffocating silence where the only sound was the frantic, erratic hammering of my own heartbeat. I sank down low in the seat, trying to make myself as small as possible, peering over the dashboard through the fogged-up windows, praying that the darkness would conceal me from the approaching threat. The footsteps grew louder, crunching on the gravel of the street just beyond the row of houses I had driven through. The deliberate pace never quickening, never slowing, just a relentless, inevitable approach. I held my breath until my lungs burned, watching the gaps between the empty houses, terrified that a silhouette would suddenly appear in the fog, looking for the trespasser who had ruined the pristine lawns. The psychological toll of the isolation began to warp my senses, making the shadows in the fog twist and contort into terrifying, impossible shapes that danced just at the edge of my peripheral vision. I thought I saw pale, expressionless faces pressing against the dark glassless windows of the empty houses, watching me with cold, dead eyes. But when I blinked, there was nothing but the void. The absolute silence was maddening, amplifying the sound of the blood rushing in my ears until it sounded like a roaring river, threatening to drown out the rhythmic footsteps that were circling my location. I started to question my own sanity, wondering if I had fallen asleep at the wheel on the interstate and this was just a lucid, unending nightmare conjured by a dying, oxygen-deprived brain. But the sharp, freezing cold of the cabin and the smell of the damp leather seats grounded me in the terrifying reality of my situation. I was awake, I was trapped, and I was being hunted. Suddenly, the dead silence of the car was shattered by the shrill electronic ringing of my cell phone lying in the cup holder. A sound so loud and unexpected I nearly screamed. I stared at the device in disbelief. The screen was brightly lit, displaying an incoming call from an unknown number. Even though the signal bars in the top corner still showed a complete lack of network connection, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the glowing green accept button, terrified of who or what could be reaching me on a dead network in a place that didn't exist on any map. My trembling thumb swiped the screen, and I brought the phone to my ear, hearing nothing but a hollow echoing static that sounded like wind blowing through an empty subterranean cavern. Then, the dry, raspy voice of the passenger, the man I had dropped off at the Hollow House, spoke directly into my ear, his tone devoid of any emotion as he asked a single question. "Are you lost?" The line went dead before I could formulate a response, the call dropping back into the suffocating silence of the cabin, leaving me holding a useless piece of plastic against my sweating cheek. The taunt ignited a spark of desperate anger that briefly overpowered my terror. I was not going to sit here in the dark and wait to be collected by whatever phantom had lured me into this trap. I twisted the key in the ignition, the engine roaring back to life, and flipped the headlights onto their highest setting, determined to find the gates and ram them at full speed if necessary. I threw the car into drive and barreled back onto the asphalt street, but as my high beams pierced the fog ahead, I slammed on the brakes in absolute horror. The street was no longer empty. Lining both sides of the curb, fading away into the misty distance, were dozens of abandoned, dust-covered vehicles. A silent, sprawling graveyard of drivers who had never found their way out. The graveyard of abandoned vehicles stretched down the fog-choked street as far as my high beams could penetrate, a terrifying chronological museum of vanished drivers. There were modern electric sedans with their batteries long dead, bulky SUVs from the early 2000s sitting on rotted rims, and even a few yellow cabs from the 90s, their iconic paint jobs faded and peeling like diseased skin. This wasn't a recent phenomenon. Blackwood Estates had been swallowing people for decades, a geographical Venus flytrap disguised as a premium surge zone. A sharp, mechanical ding echoed through my cabin, making me flinch. It was the low fuel warning, a glowing amber icon that signaled I had less than 20 miles of range left. In this labyrinth of looping roads and heavy idling, 20 miles meant mere minutes before my car became a permanent addition to the macabre collection outside my window. The slow, methodical footsteps in the fog suddenly multiplied, the single set of pacing boots joined by a dozen other unseen walkers, their synchronized crunching on the gravel echoing off the hollow houses. They weren't rushing. They were tightening the net, a slow, deliberate convergence of shadows moving through the mist, drawn by the blinding light of my high beams and the noise of my engine. I slammed the gear shift into drive, my hands slick with cold sweat, and pressed the accelerator, determined to weave my way through the gauntlet of dead cars. The gap between the abandoned vehicles was narrow, forcing me to drive at an agonizingly slow pace, the side mirrors of my sedan scraping against the rusted metal of a forgotten taxi with a horrifying, high-pitched screech. As I crept down the corridor of automotive corpses, I couldn't stop myself from looking into the windows of the cars I passed, the beam of my headlights illuminating the forgotten tragedies inside. I saw a child's car seat covered in a thick layer of dust, a moldy thermos sitting in a cup holder, and a pair of cracked sunglasses resting on a dashboard. All artifacts of lives abruptly interrupted. The fog swirled into the gaps between the cars, and for a terrifying second I thought I saw pale, indistinct figures sitting in the driver's seats, their heads turning slowly to watch me pass. I slammed my foot on the gas, deciding I would rather risk a collision than spend another second looking into the eyes of the neighborhood's permanent residents, the engine whining in protest. The engine sputtered, a violent, choking hesitation that sent a violent shudder through the entire chassis of the car, followed by the sickening loss of power steering. The fuel was finally gone, the amber light flashing a desperate final warning before the digital dashboard flickered and died, plunging the interior into a terrifying, absolute darkness. The car coasted forward on its remaining momentum, the tires rolling silently over the damp pavement before gently coming to a halt directly in front of the house with the massive dead oak tree. I had driven in a massive, chaotic circle, expending the last of my resources only to end up exactly where the nightmare had begun, right at the doorstep of the passenger's hollow house. I refused to die strapped into the driver's seat like the others, waiting in the dark for the owners of those echoing footsteps to finally reach my windows. I grabbed my flashlight, my keys, and my heavy winter coat, shoving the driver's door open and spilling out onto the wet asphalt, just as the sound of boots on gravel reached the edge of the cul-de-sac. I didn't look back to see what was emerging from the fog. I sprinted up the driveway, my legs burning with lactic acid, aiming straight for the heavy wooden front door of the unfinished house. It was a desperate, illogical gamble. But if the passenger had vanished into this empty shell, perhaps the architecture was flawed, offering a tear in the fabric of this impossible place. I threw my weight against the front door, the unlatched wood flying open and slamming against the interior studs with a bang that sent a cloud of white drywall dust billowing into the air. The inside of the house was just as barren as before, a skeletal framework of 2x4s and cold concrete. But my flashlight beam caught something at the very back of the structure that I hadn't seen through the window. Standing alone in the center of the unfinished framing, unattached to any walls, was a single solid wooden door, its peeling white paint glowing faintly in the beam of my light. The footsteps reached the front porch behind me, the floorboards groaning under the weight of multiple heavy figures, their cold, raspy breathing audible over the pounding of my own heart. I sprinted across the concrete slab, kicking up clouds of dust, and grabbed the tarnished brass handle of the freestanding door, turning it and throwing my shoulder against the wood without hesitation. I lunged forward, bracing myself to hit the muddy grass of a backyard. But instead, my boots hit rough, freezing asphalt, and the world exploded into a cacophony of deafening noise and blinding light. An air horn blasted mere feet from my head, a sound so loud it vibrated in my teeth, and a massive wall of displaced air knocked me flat onto my back. I scrambled backward, gasping for breath, and looked up to see the taillights of an 18-wheeler disappearing down a long, straight stretch of a rural interstate. I was sitting on the gravel shoulder of the highway, the freezing night air biting at my face. The fog entirely gone, replaced by a clear sky where the first hints of purple dawn were bleeding over the horizon. I spun around, expecting to see the towering black stone walls and the iron gates of Blackwood Estates looming behind me, waiting to swallow me again. But there was nothing. No gates, no stone pillars, no unmarked driveway, just an unbroken ancient wall of dense pine trees and an overgrown ditch filled with trash. The hollow house, my dead car, the graveyard of rideshare drivers, and the relentless footsteps were simply gone, erased from reality as if they had never existed. A state trooper found me wandering down the shoulder an hour later, shivering uncontrollably and clutching my flashlight like a weapon, my clothes covered in mud and drywall dust. I told him I had been carjacked by a passenger, a lie that was infinitely easier to explain than the impossible geometry and the phantom neighborhood that had stolen my vehicle. They searched the highway for miles, looking for the unmarked turnoff and the black iron gates I described, but the county records confirmed what my eyes had already seen. Blackwood Estates didn't exist, and there had never been a housing development in those woods. My car was never recovered, quietly added to the statistics of unsolved auto thefts, and the insurance payout barely covered the remaining loan. I never drove for a rideshare app again, taking a quiet daytime job stocking shelves at a local grocery store where the lights were always bright and the doors were always open. But the trauma of that night refused to stay buried, manifesting in a compulsive need to check my old driver account from a new burner phone just to ensure I was truly disconnected. 2 months later, I logged in, expecting to see a deactivated profile, but a notification immediately popped up on the screen, freezing the blood in my veins. It was a ride receipt for Blackwood Estates. The fare was $0, but under the passenger rating, there was a 5-star review from the gaunt man in the suit, accompanied by a single terrifying comment. Driver found the exit. Most don't. See you next time.